So thanks all for joining. Today we're going to be asking the question, could a universal basic income support the transition to a sustainable food system? Okay, next slide, please. So the UBI Lab Food is part of the UBI Lab network, which is part of over 40 labs across the world. The labs debate and explore the potential for a UBI to revolutionise the social security system. UBI for Food Farmers is a grassroots movement working together with us today, and they advocate for the implementation of an unconditional basic income for farmers, farm workers, and food producers in the UK. Today, we're joined by Natalie Bennett, who's previous leader of the England and Wales Green Party, member of the House of Lords, and current Green peer. She will be talking about her perspective of UBI and introduce her book titled Change Everything: Common Sense Politics for the Age of Shocks. We'll share the link to the book in the chat so that you can have a look at that. In the book, Natalie sets out a vision of hope, an alternative green vision of how we can innovate our way to freedom, prosperity, health, and resilience. So we'll invite Natalie on to speak in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So in today's event, we'll be exploring what a sustainable food system is, what current challenges exist in achieving a sustainable food system, and how a UBI may help to overcome food system challenges. And then Natalie will speak about her book and her perspective on the role of a UBI. We will conclude the session with plenty of time to ask questions and to debate the topic. Again, if you have any questions throughout the session, please do put them in the chat. If you can put question ahead of your question so that we make sure that that is a question to ask, that would be really helpful. Next slide, please. So, what is a sustainable food system? Well, we currently think of a food system as farm to fork. So this is a complex web of activities involving the production, processing, transport, and consumption of food. This image here shows all of the aspects of the food system put simply. So a sustainable food system is one that delivers food security and nutrition for all in a way that the economic, social, and environmental bases to generate food security and nutrition for future generations are not compromised. So that is all aspects support the environment and society. Next slide, please. However, the current capitalist system encourages us to seek and thus produce even cheaper food, yet still requires us producers to maintain the highest possible standards. This means that inevitably we are coming up against unsustainable limits. As such, as of present, the food system is not sustainable, nor is it resilient. It is not meeting the nutrition needs of many people. And what is more, the people working in the food system are economically vulnerable and often struggle themselves to afford food to adequately feed themselves and their families. Social security systems in place to support those most in need are failing, and as a result, many people are suffering from food insecurity. All of these challenges are being compounded by the changes to the climate that we're experiencing. Next slide, please. So, what is a UBI? So a UBI, or Universal Basic Income, is a programme in which every citizen receives a set amount of money regularly. The aim of the UBI is to alleviate poverty and replace other need-based social programmes that potentially require greater bureaucratic involvement. Next slide, please. So could a UBI support the transition to a sustainable food system? Well, a UBI may have the potential to make positive change. It could allow us to focus not just on farm to fork, but understand the power of investing in advance of the farm, going beyond intensive food production, and could allow us to invest in real production methods and allow producers to grow food of higher quality and get paid fairer for it. A UBI could also allow consumers to have real choice, empowering people to reduce the stress of not having enough money and the stress that could result in subsequent unhealthy food choices. Next slide, please. So today we're joined by UBI for Farmers, and they're a grassroots group exploring if a basic income for farmers could lead to positive changes for the farmers and others in the food system. A basic income could make farming a more viable career for younger people. It could help to encourage organic and natural processes rather than intensive options, and could help to promote well-being amongst farmers themselves. The group recently published a report summarising their position on the role of a basic income for this population. I'll ask that to be put in the chat so you can have a read. Next slide, please. So now we move to Natalie Bennett. Natalie is the former leader of the Green Party and is current Green peer in the House of Lords. She has recently written a book titled Change Everything: Common Sense Politics for the Age of Shocks. In this book, Natalie explores an alternative green vision, discussing how it is possible to achieve freedom, prosperity, health, and resilience. I will now hand you over to Natalie.
Okay, lovely. I was trying to unmute myself and the system wouldn't let me. Thank you very much, Gemma. I think that was a really great introduction, and it's great to see so many people here today taking their lunchtime to talk about universal basic income and food, which is actually putting two of my absolutely favourite subjects together. Now, as Gemma said, my book Change Everything is with the publisher now. You can pre-buy a copy. That's the last advert I do, I promise, through the link that's going down into the chat. But the key reason why I bring it up today is the first chapter of the book is about universal basic income. And that's because I think universal basic income is not a panacea. Anyone who tells you that a single policy will fix all of our problems, be very, very suspicious of anything they say after that. But it's an important foundation. And what universal basic income can do is free up people to make choices about how they spend their time, energy, and talents. If you think about our current capitalist system, most people, most of their time, energy, and talents are controlled by a boss. And we've recently been seeing even the mainstream saying how bad our management is and how bad bosses are. Or in the traditional socialist system of the last century, the state was deciding how people spend their time, energy, and talents. I very firmly believe that the best possible person to decide how to spend their time, energy, and talents is each individual. This is the ultimate freedom. It's the decommodifying of time. And we need this because one of the things that I think we're about to see a huge change around in is we still see the right wing talking about migration, talking about people as a problem. But the practical reality is that we have a huge shortage of human energy, time, and talents. Birth rates are falling off a cliff, populations are aging. And so it's actually really the energy, time, and talents we need to fix our problems. And one of our huge problems is food security and the currently extremely unhealthy food system, as Gemma mentioned. And if you want a reflection on how that is, I've just come out of the House of Lords session where I had a question down on ultra-processed foods. The minister was complaining, this was the 5th time he's been challenged in recent months on ultra-processed food because the government refuses to acknowledge that they are an issue. And he came up with the memorable phrase, and I may be putting a clip out about this shortly, there's nothing wrong with a can of Diet Coke. Oh, yes, there is. And of course, we don't have a shortage of calories now. We have nearly 1 billion people regularly going to bed hungry around the world because of our capitalist system. They don't have the money to buy that food. But we are, with the climate emergency and the nature crisis, approaching a real crunch point in terms of absolute supplies. And we also, of course, thinking about ultra-processed foods. In Britain, 50% of British calories come from ultra-processed foods, what are often described as food-like substances, wrapped, of course, in plastic, that are actively making us sick. To get the vegetables and the fruit that we need, that should be the foundation of our diet, needs an entire turnaround in our production system. Now, as I said, UBI is not a panacea for this. One of the big issues is access to land. And I'm involved with the Right to Roam movement and also the Right to Grow movement, which people might like to ask about. There's just been a success in Hull. It is the first council in the country to acknowledge a right to grow. But if we're going to be growing the vegetables and fruit we need, those young people who really would like to get involved setting up a small business, people who'd like to grow their own food, then people have to have the land available to them. And I'll point people to a great organisation called the Kindling Trust in Manchester that trains people to set up their own small farming and growing businesses. But it's really difficult for them to find land for people to set those businesses up on. So UBI, of course, a huge food issue is poverty. And indeed, as we saw the report out this week, absolute destitution. And that's something that so many people in Britain today face, with 0 hours contracts, with benefit sanctions, which are about to get even worse with people with children forced to spend up to 30 hours a week now looking for jobs or in jobs, even though many of them are simply just not going to have the time. So if you have a UBI payment, you've got the money to buy food, to put food on the table. And I've always started when arguing for a UBI from the absolute basics, which is human rights. I've yet to encounter even a conservative who won't accept that there is a right to life. And if you're going to have a right to life, then you have to have food. That's a statement of the obvious. And yet we have lots of people in our society who don't have that guaranteed food, who are relying on food banks, relying on charity. And what we're increasingly seeing is the kind of turnaround, which I've long been worrying about, whereby our food banks, many of the people who used to donate to food banks are now needing to use food banks themselves. And so, of course, the donations are going down and demand is going up. And that's a really huge problem. Now, my arguments for universal basic income are many. I do just have to mention that as a feminist since age 5, I regard UBI as a profoundly feminist policy, and that's because it doesn't assume that people get their identity in society, their position, or indeed their income necessarily from paid work. People make many contributions in caring jobs that when they're paid at all, they're very underpaid. Community jobs, community organisations, many of those jobs are occupied by women and they're unpaid. So what we do is we start to decouple how people spend their time and their money, and people can choose to spend their money well. I think there's also an argument for saying in terms of UBI that what this is essentially is an argument from the commons. If you put Elon Musk on a desert island, he wouldn't make any money at all. Elon Musk is dependent on the infrastructure that's been built by previous generations. He's reliant on people to buy his cars, to use his technology, his customers. He's reliant on all his workers. And a UBI is essentially a sharing out of that common heritage that we all have, the common contributions we all make. That's what UBI is doing. And I do particularly want to make sure that we've got plenty of time for questions. So I think it's rather than listening to me talk and look at my head, I'm going to stop fairly shortly, but I'm going to offer one final thought, one reflection that I think is really important, which is, and this comes from as many of the things in my book, as many of the things I say do, from what people have said to me. And in the East End of Glasgow, there's an organisation called the Galgale Trust. And it's a wonderful place if you ever get a chance to visit it. It started out as a protest movement against the motorway being built in Glasgow and was protecting a wood. And they slightly counterintuitively started doing woodwork using the fallen trees, the fallen logs to make wooden items. They're now a place that trains people with mental health issues and drug and alcohol dependencies or recoveries in woodworking. And someone there said to me, the thing about this community is that there is no shortage of things that need doing, but we have a huge shortage of paid jobs, and particularly well-paid jobs. And that really shows how much the current system is turned around. I mean, I'm sometimes asked in a UBI society, growing food is generally quite a nice thing to be doing in the kind of ring of market gardens around towns and cities that I'm envisaging. But, how do we get people to do the horrible jobs, which might be things like cleaning the sewers? And my answer to that is simple, which is if it's a horrible job that really needs doing, then maybe we have to pay people quite a lot to do it. Maybe we have to pay sewer cleaners more than we pay bankers. Maybe, in fact, I think we should pay sewer cleaners more than we pay bankers. So as Galgale was saying, we have all these things that need doing. And one of the things that we need doing is to transform our food system, getting away from that ultra-processed food with multinational companies that make huge profits. While, as Gemma is saying, I mean, the last figure I saw is 1 in 6 people in the food system is not paid enough to eat properly. You think about, if you still have a supermarket worker scanning the scanning your goods in a supermarket, there's a fair chance she, it's probably a she, is not paid enough money to live on. And of course, many of those jobs have now been taken away, and they expect customers to do their own work doing that. If we're going to solve the problems of food security and the unhealthy state of our food system, which means growing vastly more fruit and vegetables. I mean, the UK is horrendously lacking in supplies. We're relying on supplies coming from abroad. Yet, if we're going to be self-sufficient in vegetables and fruit, on a rough back of the envelope calculation, we need to be growing 20 times more vegetables and fruit. And that doesn't mean, and can't be done, giant industrial agriculture, enormous endless streams of fields of strawberries or apple trees that are turned into an industrial production system. It needs to be those kind of varied market garden type setups, which have jobs that pretty well anyone is able to do, is able to contribute to. That kind of transformation, a UBI sets the foundation for which we can produce the healthy food we need. And we are a deeply unhealthy society. I don't think people realize quite how unhealthy our society is. Food is a big part of that. And just one final thought. I was listening to the head of NHS England speaking at a briefing, talking about, some people are saying the NHS is falling apart. He said, no, the NHS is not falling apart. It's at risk of being overwhelmed by the volume of ill health. And we need to take a public health approach, which food is an important area of, to get the transformation we need. It's UBI. So I guess I'll finish on the thought that what we need, across all of our societies is this kind of systems thinking. What kind of world do we have to have? Do we want to create? We need to think about all of the systems that go into that, and the way in which people get their funding. UBI is an important foundation of that. And I think I've said final about 3 times, but this really will be my final thought. People have sometimes asked me, with the climate emergency, the nature crisis, the desperate poverty and inequality in our society, how do you stay hopeful? Well, what keeps me hopeful is the fact that history is not pre-written. It's made by the actions of people. And by joining in the campaign for UBI, by joining in the campaign for healthy food, by joining up these issues and talking about them and coming to events like this, going out and sharing this with other people, you are part of the change of taking us in the direction we need to go. We know there's enough resources on this planet for everyone to have a decent life, for us to look after the climate and nature, to be healthy, to have healthy food, if we just share those resources out fairly. So a message of hope, a message of positivity, and I always believe dialogue's better than monologues. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Natalie. It was really nice to finish on a moment of hope as well. I'm going to pass you over to Dave, who's going to lead the questions. If any of the audience have any questions, please do continue to put them in the chat, and we will continuously feed them into the discussion, so that we can have a good debate as we go forward. Thank you. Okay, Dave.
Thanks very much, Gemma. Thanks very much as well for that, Natalie. It's always refreshing to hear comments about food and its links to the social security system. So I've been carefully looking over the questions that have come in. We've got a couple, one from Hannah, 2 from Dan Crossley from the Food Foundation as well. But I am going to open and take the chair's privilege of this, and I'm going to ask my question first, if you don't mind, if the audience don't mind. So it's something that I'm interested from my academic background, which is on food insecurity, food poverty, but also local food and issues around supermarket dominance. So what do you see as being the potential impact that a UBI could have on local towns, small town centres, small high streets, and especially thinking about local producers? And we're joined today by UBI for farmers as well. So thinking about local producers, local retailers, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers. And I'm thinking about the potential power that a universal basic income could have through possibly local currencies, and what that means for the current supermarket domination.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that, Dave. And the supermarkets are the problem. The supermarkets are no part of the solution. That's where I would start from. And I would also point out that I think it's really important to stress the history of this, that the supermarkets of the dominance of the supermarkets is not inevitable. It's a result of policy decisions over the past few decades. It used to always be like this. And if you go to continental Europe, I was actually at an event speaking about UBI a few years ago, pre-COVID, in northern Italy. And it was just amazing how many little local food shops there were in the towns and cities that I was visiting. So Britain is a real standout, amazing, ridiculous dominance of the supermarkets. I think America, I suspect, is much the same, but certainly you compare us to our European neighbours. And just a nice case study of how that came about is until Tony Blair, it was Labour Party policy to insist that out-of-town supermarkets and shopping centres charge for parking on the same kind of grounds with the same kind of costs as town centres would. Now, one of the things that has killed town centres has been the cost and the difficulty of parking, whereas those out-of-town centres have just been able to just tarmac huge stretches of land, slap cars all over them. And of course, that also has public health impacts in terms of air pollution, has impacts in terms of congestion, et cetera, et cetera. So policy choices have been made to privilege the supermarkets. I think people, there are other ways, other places have other ways. And so it's really important to stress that. So I think if you bring in UBI, and another thing I'd like to mention, another policy that I think is really important is a 4-day working week as standard with no loss of pay, a campaign area that's done a huge amount of work. And the thing is, of course, I know Sheffield Market really well, for example, and you see lots of people when I'm able to go to Sheffield Market, and you see lots of people there, but it's basically open until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So anyone who works standard working hours, the market is not available to them. If you have people with a 4-day working week as standard, if you have people with UBI, that whole issue of time, most people these days feel incredibly time poor, feel incredibly pressured. We've got all the caring responsibilities for youngers and elders and everything else. A UBI freeing up people's time means you've got time to go to a local shop at a time when the local shop is likely to be open. And I think, we really have to ask a question about the supermarkets. Why do we have to have supermarkets open all hours of the day and night? And, why do people then have to work all hours of the day and night in those supermarkets? So, if we basically go to a situation where people have the time to go to a local shop, of course, this is where everything being joined for everything else, is there a public transport to allow people to get to that local shop? Because we don't want them driving into the town centres. Often it's impractical to drive into the town centres. And, just an aside on that, because low traffic neighbourhoods and pedestrianisation is such an issue at the moment, actually the evidence shows that small shops do better when streets are pedestrianised, when there is less traffic. And that's really worth saying. So let's make towns, the centres of small cities, the places where people want to go. They're nice, they're pleasant, they're attractive. Again, joining everything up, we have a loneliness epidemic. If people go in, every Tuesday they go into the local cheese shop and, have a nice chat about which cheese to buy, then that is an interaction in the week. And for lots and lots of people, that may be their only human interaction of the day. And to have a nice interaction with that nice lady in the cheese shop who's always offering some nice, new thing I could try, how much better that is than, running along, walking along a row of plastic wrapped things in the supermarket and then scanning it at the self-service till. It's a question about what kind of society we want, as well as, of course, feeding people and poverty. And the problem is at the moment, lots of those smaller shops, they do struggle to match. They can't match very often the supermarkets on price. But the fact is that the supermarkets are actually externalizing huge amounts of their costs. The supermarket doesn't pay for the disposal of the plastic that's wrapped around that cheese, or that's wrapped around the vegetables or whatever. The supermarket doesn't pay for the air pollution that people have created for getting there. So if you actually end up with a balanced playing field, then small shops can compete. And that's absolutely crucial for the quality of our society, the health of our society, the life of our society. Thanks very much, Dave.
No, definitely agree. I'm just reflecting on that because, we actually are the ones who end up paying for the disposal of all the plastic wrapping through our council tax when the council comes and collects our bins. That's a fantastic answer. I'm going to now introduce Joe Poulton, who is part of the UBI for Farmers, because we've got a question for Joe as well. So we're linking together, you know, the environment, the farming, the food. So there's a question from Dan Crossley from the Food Ethics Council. And he's saying this as a supporter of basic income. We know we've had Dan, who's chaired one of our events previously. How would a basic income for farmers differ from a basic payment scheme that was part of the EU's Common Agricultural Policy?
Lovely, thank you, Dan, and thanks for introducing me, Dave. Yes, so a basic payment scheme was a subsidy that went to farmers and landowners based on like an area-based payment, whereas what we're sort of proposing for UBI for Farmers is we're looking at individuals, farm workers, food producers, those who don't necessarily have land or own land. So hopefully that will encourage more young people into the workforce, a more diverse workforce. And historically, small-scale farmers have been overlooked through the basic payment scheme. So, you know, apparently 80% of subsidies used to go to 20% of the largest landowners through the basic payment schemes. And we're looking at making sure that small-scale farmers don't continue to fall through the gaps and that they have a foundational safety net through a basic income to let them do their good work of small-scale horticulture. And a sad stat that I read this morning was in 1950, there was 160,000 smallholdings in the UK, and now that number is down to 30,000. So we desperately need something to look at small-scale farmers and re-energize that part of the community. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Thanks.
If I can just add into that, I mean, I think one of the problems is the government has actively discouraged small-scale production. I mean, under the Common Agricultural Payments cap, there was most of those smallholders would get no cap money at all. And even I was just trying to remember, I had a debate with the minister about this 9 or 12 months ago. I think even with the current payment system, they say they've brought the minimum down, but it's still like 2 hectares or something, which is beyond the rate. You know, lots of people will start at least at a scale smaller than that. I think there's really an issue here that the government has always been thinking about farms will just keep getting bigger and bigger, and that's inevitable, and it's an industrial scale production. And you know what that has meant, and there's something of an attempt to reverse this now. It's meant grubbing out the hedges, flattening the ground, filling in the ponds. It's industrialized our countryside, and we're seeing, you know, we are one of the most nature depleted corners of this much battered planet, and that's because of, in large part, because of those policies. And so small scale inevitably is going to be better for nature. It introduces more diversity, more variety. I mean, I'll mention Wakeland's agroforestry, which is just the most amazing site. There's a wonderful aerial photo, and surrounding it is all these industrial sugar beet fields. Now, you know, the British Sugar wants to double the amount of sugar we produce, whereas in fact, if we actually produce 2/3 of the sugar we do now, and didn't import a grain of sugar, we would have more than enough sugar in the British diet for a healthy diet. But Wakeland's agroforestry, there's these, you know, battered giant arable fields dead all around it. The aerial photo shows, you know, strips of 100-meter wide of cropping land with trees or hedges in between them. And if you go and visit it, it has just the most amazing wildlife, birds, deer, hares, all around living in that space with food production. And Wakelands, you know, interestingly, has a race of wheat they're developing. So rather than a simple genetically identical crop, they've got a range of wheat in there, which is, it requires an artisan baker. This kind of comes back to your point, Dave, about small shops and small producers. You know, the industrial ultra-processed bread going through the Chorleywood process can't cope with variety in the wheat. But if you've got a local baker who gets their local, you know, from the local mill, gets the delivery of flour, looks at it and goes, right, I'm going to have to do this with this to bake nice loaves with it, you've got a whole totally different food system in there.
Yeah, it's definitely that local knowledge which you know, helps support local communities, local practices as well. So thinking about local and thinking about our link to the global, I'm going to take the next question from from Lopa. I've not seen Lopa for a good few years. So Lopa is asking any useful insights from universal basic income trials that have been held outside of the UK. Now, that's up to both of you how you want to think about this, whether it's in terms of farming or whether it's in terms of communities, but it'd be nice to hear about both.
Okay, I'll go first. I mean, one of the things that in the trials in the Global South, now, I mean, the Global South is obviously very different to the kind of scenario that we're in. But one of the things that's happened in the Global South is it's tended to more often be on a regional kind of basis. And so a whole village has got UBI, for example. And one of the things that's meant is people have been able to cooperate together to get resources. And so one of the things that a UBI might enable people to do, and I'm here sort of joining the Global South experience with something I saw in Wales, where I saw there was a market garden on the outskirts of Cardiff, and this is probably 10 years ago now, that I visited. It had some money from the Welsh government to fund sort of a trial to see how do we commercially set up a sort of 20-acre market garden and make it work. And it employed about 5 people. And the big mistake they'd made, the lesson they said that they wanted to share with everybody, so I'll share it with people on this call today: don't buy a cheap tractor. Now, I suspect all of the farmers on this call already, are well aware of that issue, but it is worth saying that, they spend half their time repairing the tractor. But if you had 5 or 6 market gardens together, what they were saying is then you could buy a share in the tractor. And so similarly, if we think about if you have UBI on a regional level, if you have 5 or 6 people who decide together that they want to set up, a cooperative set of market gardens, if you've got perhaps customers who are getting UBI who say, we'll support you, you can buy a decent tractor. So what I'm getting at is the UBI, if you have it on an area basis, rather than lots of the trials in the West, for example, in Finland, have been with people who are long-term unemployed, for example. So it's scattered all over a city or all over a country. On an area basis, you're actually putting resources in that people know that's coming in so they can commit. So share those resources and buy shared resources. And I think that's what's happened in some of those Global South trials. People have, funded a medical clinic, funded various things. So that's what you can do.
Joe, do you have any comment on farming?
Yeah, there's not massive amount of data on farming specifically. There are some trials that have gone on in India and I think Korea or South Korea, and they've had people in rural areas receiving basic income for pilots, but there's not masses of information about how it affects farmers directly, and that's sort of why we've established what we have, and hopefully eventually we will set up our own pilot and design that and trial and see what actually happens. And we want to look at both sort of bioregions, how that would affect an entire food system in one area, but also affect different farmers, large scale, small scale, urban, non-urban, new entrants, people who have been in it for 50 years. So yeah, it's exciting, but we don't have the data yet, but hopefully we will get there at some point.
Okay, so I'm going to take another question now, which is about coming back to local foods. Hopefully both of you can reflect on this as well in terms of, larger scale growers, but also small scale growers. And it comes from Adrian Oldman. Adrian says, I liked Natalie's approach to being more self-sustainable in food generally. But how can a UBI help individuals be able to grow their own food, either in neighbourhood gardens or allotments, rather than market gardens owned by farmers around the outskirts of towns? This is something that's just been mentioned as well by Natalie. If we encourage more people to grow their own food, they'll become more interested in what they eat.
So since that referenced me, I'll start. I think the UBI, one of the key things is the democratization of time, and so many people now are have 2 or 3, often 0 hours contracts, jobs, and they're slamming together, and they've got care responsibilities and so many other things. I mean, one of the most horrifying things I ever heard was the shop workers union in Sheffield. I was speaking to one of their workers who just was clearly just sort of totally in shock because she'd just been signing a food bank voucher for a woman who had 7 0 hours contract jobs, but basically none of them had delivered that week the woman just couldn't feed her family. And so giving people that foundation. And I mean, in Sheffield again, Sheffield, the Sustainable Food Institute, I think it's called, at the University of Sheffield, has done a lot of really interesting work. I'll try and dig up some links in a second. Looking at Sheffield could be 122% self-sufficient in fruit and vegetables, because Sheffield's a very green city, if it just grew within the city boundaries. And that would be, a lot of that would be people growing their own. You could take a patch in the local park where there's just sort of green grass that no one ever uses, and put some fruit trees on it and look after those fruit trees, or put a vegetable garden on it or whatever. It's very, very possible to do that. The UBI, but in Sheffield at the moment, if you go, and as I have, go canvassing on some of the very poor estates, you see virtually no food growing there, even though people actually have the land. But of course, seeds cost money. A shovel costs money. There's no guarantee of return when you start out on this and you don't know very much about how it all works. I've been through this many times. I've fed a great many slugs over the years with many Brassicaceae. I've produced some very fat slugs in various places. I also used a beer trap, which then I ended up with a slightly staggering Staffordshire Bull Terrier dog who really liked the beer traps for the slugs. It's a live and learn process. And if you're living on the edge financially, as most people are now, to take that risk, and also just to have the headspace. So many people now are just struggling to survive. In the back of their head all the time is, am I going to be able to make the rent at the end of this week? Where's the headspace to really think about and plan and put a vegetable garden in the back garden? You've got to afford the stuff, you've got to afford the time, you've got to afford the headspace. And UBI is actually freeing people up potentially to have that time, headspace, and the ability to put a little bit of money into some seeds, into a shovel and all the other things you might need.
Jo, do you have a comment as well?
Yeah, from like a farming perspective, I guess I think it's brilliant that people, if they want to grow their own food, that they have the means to do so. But I'm also thinking, like, how can we avoid food waste in the system that already exists? So if there was farmers who received UBI, but also citizens who received UBI, could there be like stronger gleaning networks or ways that they could communicate with local members of the public to say, we've got a whole field full of cauliflower, we don't have the time to get it up, who wants as much cauliflower as you can fit in your fridge? And then everyone would come down and harvest it and connect with the food in that way. So for me, I'm sort of looking at it from like a farmer food waste, how do we bring those things together now, and then in the future, if people can grow their own food, I mean, that's a dream.
Okay, I'm going bigger picture now with this one, and we're going political. So I would guess this question's aimed quite considerably at Natalie's work. So this comes from Diana Finch, asks the question: the biggest problem is getting the political will to move in this direction. No party is going to adopt something so radical in isolation and risk ridicule or being seen as taking a huge risk that would create potentially a fantastic society that most people can't imagine, as it's so far removed from their current paradigm. So the question is the answer to do cross-party work to build consensus that this is what is needed, or is it to try and end our current party-based representative democracy?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm going to start by disagreeing with you, Diane, that no party would adopt this, because the Green Party has indeed adopted this. This has been Green Party policy for decades, but we actually started for putting it front and centre in the 2015 election. And yes, I do have some scars from facing up to the mainstream media and defending UBI to show for that. But nonetheless, that was part of a process that's now seen UBI come much more front and centre. And in fact, there's some really interesting work coming out of the University of Northumberland, which did some research. And again, I don't know if anyone's able to dig this up, on people's attitude to UBI. And they picked up a sample group of quote unquote ordinary citizens, people who were not political at all, and ran the whole idea of UBI past it, explained it to them. And by the end of it, they overwhelmingly convinced these people that UBI was a great idea. But what the response was, oh yes, but politics doesn't change everything. And so what we're encountering doesn't change anything. Everything just stays the same. Politics doesn't work. And so I think what we're encountering here is part of a much broader issue. And we're actually in a real structural situation here, that if we think about, we go back to, I'm getting really big picture here now, but to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And you might recall Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis. And so since then, there's been a theory that politics is just managerialism. You can't basically put a cigarette paper between the political positions of the Tory party and the Labour Party. There was obviously in recent history a period where that wasn't the case, but broadly speaking, that has been, and I would say continues to be true. And so people have lost faith that politics can change anything. And one of the things we need to do is restore people's faith that politics can change things. And that means understanding what politics is. And sometimes people think of politics as just being the stuff that happens over the road from me, where I'm sitting now in the chamber of the Lords and the Commons, and elections and things. But politics is people getting together collectively to improve their world. And that can be school kids starting a campaign on plastics in the school canteen. It can be us talking today. And what we have to do is restore people's faith in politics. And that means getting people involved in politics. So it doesn't have to be party politics. But I mean, to finally sort of answer Diane's question, I think we do need party politics, because if you just end up with whole collections of independents, what do they stand for? I mean, there's been some great people. A few years ago now, there was a doctor who was Save the Local Hospital campaigner elected as an MP. But, what was his position of being? I have no idea. I mean, he was quite decent, so I can probably guess. But what would his position have been on what's happening now in Gaza or something? Unless you have people who represent a political philosophy, a political approach, a political way of doing things. And you might say that party politics hasn't broadly been like that in the last few years. But what we should be is, and where you have proportional representation systems, you have political philosophies across the spectrum that are all represented. And so you know what you're voting for. And I don't think you can get away from that. Thanks.
Joe, I'd still like to throw this up into Joe as well, if you had a comment to make as well. No,
I think you covered it all. Thank you.
Okay, so I am gonna go take this little, the political discussion a little bit further with Natalie, and feel free to also join in as well, Joe, too. But there's another question from Lopa, who asks, to make the business case, while we need to quantify benefits, and in brackets she's put cost to public health avoided, for example, is there an estimate of UK budget required to make a universal basic income feasible? And this is in reference to move the debate further than where we currently are.
Okay, well, basically the general rule of thumb on this is that if you're going to bring in a UBI, and the level we've set it at is about the level of job seekers allowance, the basic universal credit. About half the cost is met from saving existing benefits and the fact that you save a huge amount of administration costs. You think about what the cost of administering universal credit is, all those job centres where you have people being quizzed and challenged and sanctioned and all the rest of it. You take all those administrative costs out. One of the things about UBI is it's very cheap to administer. So broadly speaking, about half the cost comes from reshaping the existing benefits. The other half you have to find. Now, that is a political question, and generally speaking, the British budget doesn't operate by means of hypothecation. So you don't normally have allocated sums. But what we have done as the Green Party over recent elections is, depending on the politics of the time, we've framed it in different ways. So in 2015, the funding was very much focused on making rich individuals and multinational companies pay their taxes and raising the tax rates for the highest income earners, and for corporations, that's large companies. It's worth saying that it used to be, and lots of people have forgotten this, used to be a corporation tax paid by the largest companies was 10 percentage points higher than the tax rate paid by small businesses. Blair reduced that differential, Cameron abolished it altogether. If you restore the differential so that big multinational companies, we're coming back to the fact that supermarkets paying their share of taxes, which is another issue altogether. So that was how we framed the funding of it in 2015. 2019, when you may recall the Gilets Jaunes were very big in France. What we were particularly looking at doing was having a high and escalating carbon tax, which we need to do to cut our carbon emissions, and that would apply to things like meat as well. But we were actually funding the UBI through that carbon tax. So people were getting the security they get from the UBI from the carbon tax. So in terms of, I think, and I don't quite know, I can guarantee you the UBI will be in our manifesto for the next coming general election. Exactly how we frame that. In fact, we'll be doing both the carbon tax and the taxing multinational companies and rich individuals. But how we actually frame it is dependent on what, it works at the time, essentially.
So a similar question I'm going to ask to Joe. How do you think the farming community could move further on basic income?
Well, I think we still need an awareness campaign. So we set up our little group in January, and we've probably reached about 500 farmers in the UK through sort of social media campaigning and hosting conversations. But so many people in the farming community still don't know what a universal basic income is and what it might mean. And especially with all the moving goalposts of the payment mechanisms in the aftermath of Brexit, it's just, there's a lot going on for the farming community right now. So how we move it forward is, hosting more conversations, trying to get a pilot off the ground, raising awareness through people receiving money in the pilot scheme and maybe already being in established farm situations, so they can talk to their employees or their employers about the situation of them receiving a basic income. And it's really great that you mentioned the supermarket record profits there, Natalie, because we've been talking in the working group about how it could be funded, and we were saying how beautiful it would be if there was like a wealth fund established through the extortionate profits of supermarkets, but that sort of blue sky thinking. But that's where we're at the moment. We're thinking, how do we move forward? We need to raise awareness at this stage.
Okay, I've got an interesting question from Lucy Antle, who works for Feedback. So Lucy's asked, she's stating first, where I work, we don't have either supermarkets or local food shops. So a question then is, how might we harness universal basic income to support local food pantries, which she then says are unsustainable in the long term anyway? I would guess that's more directed to Joe first.
So our vision, our utopic vision, is that we would have a patchwork of small-scale farms popping up in every constituency, and there'd be closed loops, shorter supply chains, local food to local people without many food miles. So the need in our head, in our vision, for food pantries and food banks would hopefully start to diminish as those sort of direct sales from farm to food citizens are sort of shortened.
And just to add to that, I do quite a lot of events with the Plunkett Foundation, which funds community shops, community pubs, other community facilities. And so one of the things they've done in the kind of areas that I think Lucy's talking about, and of course they can be urban areas as well as rural areas, but they most of the Plunkett Foundation stuff is, I think, in rural, is you might have a pub that's closing down, the community says, no, we want to keep this facility. They set it up as that might be the place where it stays as a pub. If people have a UBI, then they might have time to be volunteer workers in that pub. That pub can also be the hub where there's, on Thursdays you go and collect your bag of fruit and vegetables from the local farmers groups. It can be a hub where you can buy local produce. Someone's gone and collected a lot of berries from the hedgerows and made a big batch of jam and sells some of it through the pub, or indeed it goes on the pub menu. All of those kind of things, if you've got those local centres, those local hubs. But what people, they tend to happen now mostly in areas that have a lot of social capital, which often means fairly early retired, fairly wealthy people who've got the time to do those kind of things. I mean, that's one of the things, if you look at the history of this, back in Victorian times, who got a universal basic income? I would posit that actually Church of England, local pastors and reverends were the people who got the equivalent of a universal basic income. They were often the people who did a great deal of science. A lot of the naturalist writings came out of people like that. They had a payment. No one really expected them to do very much for it, and they could just occupy themselves however they liked. Lots of people might think that, running a little local food store would be a great way to spend some of their time.
Fantastic. That leads very nicely into this next question, which I've just been flicking through the chat just to find a nice link to that. And it comes from Janine McMahon, who asks, so how does, and I'm guessing both of you are very well aware of Incredible Edibles. So how does this link with the Incredible Edible Network, who've been campaigning to Parliament for a right to grow, citing that Hull have been the first city to achieve this, and now public and local people need to get the right to grow their own food in public and green spaces. So I'm guessing the question is, how can we move forward, linking with groups such as Incredible Edibles to, pursue this right for people to be able to grow their own food?
Well, I mean, it's something that I started to really focus on after an event in Sheffield, talking about food security 6-9 months ago. And I put right to grow, I think probably for the first time in Hansard, and it's something that I'm really keen to push. I was talking about access to land, and what the whole arrangements are, and some places this will work very well, some places it'll work less well, is where there's public land that's not really being put to any particular use. There's the right for people to be able to say, hey, we want to grow food on this. And there's as I said, somewhere like Sheffield, there's an enormous amount of land to which that would apply. Some other places which are sort of much tighter, much smaller, it may be less true. And that's where I think, the issue of land reform, and it is one of my favorite phrases, because if you think about me sitting on the red benches in the House of Lords facing all the Tory hereditaries opposite me, I do sort of lean forward and go, well, what we really need is land reform, and watch them all wince. But we have the most concentrated land ownership in Europe. In Scotland, there's been some interesting progress where communities have the right to buy back land, to get land under their own control and do what they want with it. I think we need to look at developing the same thing in England. If a town or a city or a village even wants a ring of market gardens or half a dozen market gardens around it, to get that established, they should have a right to get access to that land, to use that land, to be available to it. And I sit across from some people who own half of 2 counties or 3 counties. That's not a situation that we can continue to leave where we are now.
I agree. I think Incredible Edible are incredible, amazing. It's such a great thing, and it just really helps everyone. If we can learn how to grow, it will help new entrants who might get a taste for growing in that space, and then one might want to go on to like farming in a bigger way. But I just think, the whole thing is intersecting. It all really does link back to sort of the enclosures and the commons being taken away, and the problems that farmers are facing right now are so much to do with that. So if we can make that land accessible to many more people, I think it's only going to be a good thing, and we should all push for a right to grow.
Okay, I've got one final question before we close, because we're approaching the end of our hour, and it comes from Colin McCullough, who's asked quite an interesting topical political question, which is open to Jo as well to get her reflections on this. So Colin is asking, would you offer a universal basic income to farm workers who are temporary, seasonal, and non-citizens of the UK?
It's a really good question, and it's something that we would have to sort of look into when we start designing these pilots and trialing it, and seeing if there's anyone that we can sort of catch within that group to see sort of the impacts of that. But it's a really, really good question. It's something we're thinking about a lot.
I mean, Green Party position has always been that immigration policy is a separate issue, and we would have very different policies to the current ones, the current government, and I won't get into that now. But we used to talk about citizens' income back 15 years ago. We don't do that anymore because the political framework has changed. So we talk about universal basic income. If you're accepted as a member of our society, then you get a universal basic income. So, if you've been invited in to be a farm worker, then yes, you would get a universal basic income. What I would say, however, is I think that I talked about human resources being scarce, birth rates falling off a cliff, aging populations. The whole model of bringing people from fringe societies or from the fringe of the global north or from the global south, and assuming that they're going to come here and use their time, energy, and talents to produce food for us. That is a model which is deeply problematic. Their labour, their talents, their time may well be needed in their own society. I want a world in which everyone is free to move if they want to, but no one is forced to move. And so, what a lot of those people are coming into at the moment is, they've got a job to supply exactly ripe strawberries to a supermarket, when the supermarket rings up the previous night and demands, double the quantity because they think they're going to sell lots. And they sit on the back of a tractor all day shoveling strawberries into punnets, a job that most of us, I'm going to say safely on this call, couldn't possibly physically manage. If you have a ring of market gardens around towns and cities, and the strawberries come when the strawberries decide to grow, and they're picked, as part of the whole package that goes to people in their fruit bag that day, it's a different kind of labour. You don't have to be, realistically a fit young person in their 20s to be the worker who produces the food. So we've really got to think about that model that relies on importing people who very often are exploited, laden with debt, all sorts of issues. We've really got to think about that model for the future. I mean, there probably needs to be a period of transition, but that's not the model we should be looking forward to the future.
A nice way to end. I'm now thinking about Ebenezer Howard and Garden Cities movement, and thinking about how important that could have been. But what I am going to do is I'm going to offer my thanks on behalf of myself and Gemma, and I'm going to hand back to I'm going to hand over to Remco Peters, who's also from the UBI Lab Food. Is Remco there?
Wow. Hello, everybody. Wow, this was a lot of really rich information. Thank you all for attending. And on behalf of UBI Lab Food, on behalf of UBI for Farmers, the wider UBI Lab network, thank you so much for attending this event and also for your wonderful questions. I realize that we didn't have enough time to address all questions. We will follow up with you, and let's please continue this conversation and continue discussing what the potential of a UBI could be for the food system. Thank you as well to Natalie for your time and thoughts. I think we can all listen to you the entire day. Unfortunately, we just had an hour today. Really appreciating it. And yeah, looking forward to doing more things together. If our discussion today has got you hungry for more, we at UBI Lab Food, UBI Farmers would be more than happy to hear from you. And we would also like to invite you to join future events. We do hope to continue hosting events, do more promotion. We're also, many of us also interested in doing a bit of research. So if you have any ideas, let's all do it together as a group. And let's continue talking about the role of UBI on food systems. So again, please do get in touch. Thank you all for being here and for staying with us until the end. And again, a great thank you to Natalie Bennett for her time and her great wisdom. And also thank you to Joanna for being here with us, contributing wonderfully from UBI for Farmers at such a late hour in Australia. Thank you all.